Okay, so we're going to talk um, about section 4.3, which is going to get into talking about the social issue of poverty here in this video. Um, Before we do that, I want to give you a couple of education and action statements. I like to do this occasionally. Um, this one is to be efficient with your time at work so you can leave work at work. Okay, that's the main takeaway here. So what do I mean by that? Well, it's easy to get into your job and want to socialize and want to talk to colleagues and want to go to the break room or go to the teacher's lounge or whatever. And when you do, you tend to get behind on work, whether that's grading or keeping up your attendance or preparing for the next day or the next week or whatever it may be, making copies. Any of those things can be things that you need to get done for your classes, but then because you spent so much time socializing, you didn't take advantage of the time you had, and so you got behind, and now all of a sudden you got to take work home. I have found in my experience that if I want to get all my work done at school, I can get all my work done at school. My wife is very efficient when she is not on duty, whether that's break duty or lunch duty or morning duty or whatever it is. She's in her room, and if she's got stuff to do, she's working. And she never brings anything home. My first years teaching, I was also coaching, and so I spent most of my free time, and I use that term very loosely, was spent preparing for baseball or practice or things of that sort. And so I end up bringing a lot of work home. Now that I am at ICC, it's a lot easier for me to get my work done at work so that I don't have to take it home. And that benefits you, your family, your kids. I mean, everybody benefits when you can do that. So that's my advice to you. So I'll ask you this. This kind of leads into where we're going today and where we've talked about in our previous video. Is it a problem that kids are at home by themselves for hours after school? And so this kind of feeds into what we were talking about in our previous video about parents working and all of that. And I'll answer the question. Yes, it can be a problem, especially if they're home by themselves. And when you stay at work and you're working late hours, well, somebody's got to take care of your kid. Is your kid coming to your school, or is your kid doing something else? I feel like this statement really could apply to any career. Be efficient at work so you can leave work at work. But for teachers especially, it's easy to say, oh, I want to do all this great stuff. I want to plan all these great things, and I have all these ideas, and I need all the material, and I need to plan and all that stuff. But when you do, sometimes your family gets neglected. So you don't want to have your kids at home by themselves, or trying to be in the room while you're trying to do all your work. So be efficient at work so you can leave work at work. So we had left off in our previous video and had been talking about some risk factors and some ways to know if students may or may not be successful based off family dynamics. And we use this in education all the time, various risk factors. For example, if you are familiar with our academic support center that we have now on campus, when that project was first being developed, I was trying to get some additional experience and kind of volunteering for some things, and I asked our VP of instruction if there was anything she had I could work on, any kind of projects or anything that I could help with. And she said, yeah, here's something we're working on. It was creating this academic support center, and she said, we're going to revamp what we've done in the past, and we need to figure out how to get people into this program, how to roll them out of the program, criteria for what should make them go in versus what keeps them out, all these things. And so I was kind of on the front lines of developing that program. Odds are most of you probably are not involved in that. Some of you maybe are. But one of the things that we did was we looked at what are risk factors that determine if a student might be successful or unsuccessful. And at the college level, it's a little different than at the high school level or the elementary school level. But we did the same type of thing. We took risk factors and we said, okay, if a student meets this many risk factors, they're automatically going to roll into this program. And they're going to be part of this program because odds are, based on statistics and data, they're probably not going to be very successful without some type of intervention. And then if they are successful after the first semester, we can roll them out of the program if they meet these qualifications. And so we kind of use this same idea. And so when we're looking at the K through 12 system, some additional risk factors, and again, just kind of closing up this last thought from section 4.2, when you have students that are living with two parents, they're at less risk than those that are living in a single parent home. Again, we've talked about the reasoning for that. The head of the household is a high school dropout. Again, we've mentioned that. That could be something that is just lessens the value that that family puts on education. Family income is below the poverty line. This is why I really want to start with this slide, because we're going to talk about poverty in some detail in just a few minutes. And when families are below the poverty line, that is a major, major problem from an academic standpoint for those students. And so we'll talk more about that in a few minutes. The parent has no steady full-time employment. That also is a problem. It kind of leads to that poverty. It leads to uncertainty about just the basic needs. And we know that students have basic needs, and so sometimes that can take away from their ability to focus on school because they're focused on, well, where's my next meal going to come from, or where am I going to sleep tonight, or maybe I didn't sleep at all last night and so I'm tired so I can't focus. And so there are some of those issues. Family receives welfare benefits. If a family is receiving welfare benefits, they're living below the poverty line, more than likely, and they're not able to afford some of the basic necessities. And ideally, welfare is designed to provide money for those who cannot work for whatever reason. In our society today, in 2020, we are to the point where if somebody goes, well, I'm just depressed and so I can't go to work, well, they can get a welfare benefit. And while depression is a real thing, that doesn't necessarily need to be something that keeps a person from being able to work and get money for it. So people are taking advantage of the system, but when the system is done like it's supposed to, then welfare ends up being a really good thing. What we're talking about, though, are those people that are typically going to be taking advantage of the welfare. They say, well, I could work, but if I stay home, the government's going to send me a check, and so I don't really have to worry about working. Again, that shows the students that, hey, if I just don't do anything, the government's going to take care of me. And that's not a good thing. Also, if the kid doesn't have health insurance, that can be a problem. It can be a risk factor for their lack of success in school, because they may be sick and they can't afford to go to the doctor, so they stay home and they're missing a lot of days, and so that too can be a problem. And so all of that kind of leads into our conversation about poverty. So when we talk about poverty, we're talking about people that are typically going to be unemployed or are working minimum wage jobs. And these things are going to contribute to a very large number of people living below the poverty line. Okay, now, when we talk about poverty, you need to understand the poverty rate, or the poverty line that we're talking about, I believe, as of 2018, I believe this is right, was like $26,000 a year. Now, as a first-year teacher, you're going to make really closer to $10,000 more than that your first year. So if it's just you and you're single and all that, you're gonna have pretty decent money. But let's think about this. Think about all the cost that a family has. So I always think it's humorous when a kid says they're just going to drop out of school. Because I always say, what are you going to do? How are you going to make money? And unless it's, well, I'm going to live off welfare, they say, oh, well, I've got a good job and I'm making good money. And I say, okay, but what if you're having to pay for everything? Because typically, a teenager or a kid that's, first couple of years in college, probably not paying for everything. And when I say everything, I'm meaning a house, a car, your cell phone, internet, TV, health insurance, auto insurance. I mean, all of those things. Lights, your basic utilities. By the time you start adding all those things up, your monthly check goes by really fast. And that's not counting like groceries and gas. And so by the time you add all those things up, you can see very easily how if somebody's only making $26,000 a year, well, that's not very good. That's living well below that poverty line. And they can't provide just the basic necessities. And so what happens is a lot of these students that live in poverty become homeless. If a kid's missing a ton of school, that may be a sign that they don't have a consistent home to go to. They may have social or adjustment problems. If a kid has moved from school to school because they can't afford to pay rent, and so they're having to move apartments, which means they're moving from house to house or apartment to apartment, then they may have problems adjusting socially and just to a new place. And oftentimes they're going to have academic problems. A lot of times they're going to not be sleeping well at night, and so they are tired when they get to school and they fall asleep when they get to school. And here's the shocking thing. You may have students that are homeless and you never know it. And that is hard to think about, that you wouldn't know that a kid is homeless. But there are oftentimes students who are homeless and you as a teacher have no idea. Now they may be living with an aunt or an uncle or or some relative for a little while, but usually that's not going to be on a long-term basis. And so if you see a kid that's missing a lot of school, or you see these academic problems, or you see that they're falling asleep, sometimes that may be a sign that this kid is living in poverty. And so here becomes the question. We talk about this in schools. Can schools eliminate poverty? Now, you may say yes, you may say no. There's arguments to both sides. I would argue that no, not completely. Now, schools can help because schools are a place where a student can gain an education, and that student can go out into the world, get a job, get a good paying job, because education is pretty accessible, right? K through 12 students are getting to go to school for free. If in our situation, if you live in ICC's 5 school district, then you are, and you graduated from one of the high schools in that district, then you can get your tuition paid for. You're basically going for, maybe not completely for free, but for very, very cheap. Sometimes, if your grades are good and those things, you can go for free. So, to not get an education, really there's not an excuse at this point if a student wants to. But here's the problem. A lot of students don't want to break the cycle. So I've seen kids who were completely content to live the way they always lived because they didn't know any difference. They didn't know that there was another lifestyle out there besides the poor lifestyle they've always been in. And as you know, people sometimes don't like change. And so if they don't have, if they're not willing to change and not willing to do something different, then it's hard to break that cycle of living in poverty. And so, can schools eliminate it? No, not completely, because you can't make a student get an education to break that cycle. However, it can be helpful, so it can eliminate some of it. And so there's an educator by the name of Ruby Payne, and she writes about hidden rules and unspoken clues that drive decision making among different socioeconomic groups. And so what she says is that the middle class is going to really be driven by work and achievement. So you think about you wanting to be a teacher, you are probably somewhat motivated by the work and achievement of being a teacher, right? It's probably not about some other things. Those are probably your top motivations. For me, I am getting a higher degree because I want to be challenged and do something a little bit different than what I'm doing currently within a college system. And so it's about that work and that achievement. When students, though, are in poverty, depending on what kind of poverty they're in, what motivates them and what helps them make decisions is often different. So, for example, if a student is in generational poverty, what we mean by that is that they have been they're in poverty currently. The generation before them was also in poverty, and maybe even the generation before them was in poverty. So when that happens, a lot of times these students or this group of people are motivated, and their decision making is based on survival, which makes sense, right? Having a place to live, being able to eat, just basic survival needs. Entertainment, which I always find interesting, that group specifically is motivated by entertainment and relationships. And so a lot of times that generational poverty, those relationships are what have kind of kept that poverty cycle going, even though it's not a good cycle to be in. They say, well, I don't want to leave my family, or I don't want to be different than my family. This is what I know. And so maybe they don't break that cycle. And then if it's a first generation family living in poverty, a lot of times they're going to be their decision making is based on their need for entertainment, and relationships are more important than achievement. So it's about their connection with people, their relationships that they have, whether that's a mother-child, a sibling, maybe a spouse partner type relationship. That's a lot of times what motivates and guides that decision making instead of achieving something. And so I just find that interesting as far as the motivation. So here's something that she writes, and this is on page 101 in your book if you want to look at it, just below just at the bottom half of the page. It says, Payne cites an example of how a teacher, while working with a 17-year-old student who did not do his homework on a positive and negative numbers, suggested that it would be acceptable if his friends cheated him at cards. The student was furious at the idea. The teacher insisted that the student wouldn't know whether they were cheating him because he didn't know positive and negative numbers. The student grabbed a deck of cards to show the teacher that he did know how to keep score. After this display, the teacher said, "Then you know how to do positive and negative numbers. I expect you to do your homework." From then on, the student did the homework regularly. So this was a student that was living in poverty, and he was motivated by the entertainment value. The entertainment of, well, if you don't learn this, you're not going to be able to play cards, and you're just going to get cheated. And if you're playing for money by chance, then you're going to lose all your money because your friends are going to cheat you because you don't know the difference in positive and negatives. And that motivated him to say, "Oh, I do too, let me show you." And then once he showed, "Well, yeah, I can do this," and she said, "Okay, you can do your homework." And so that's an example of somebody in poverty being motivated by the entertainment as opposed to being able to achieve something. The kid didn't want to learn positive and negative numbers and how to work with those, but he wanted to be able to show that he could play cards and he could be good at that. And so the teacher used that as an example to say, okay, that shows me that you do know how to do this, so you need to do your homework. So as we continue talking about poverty, the teachers in the schools cannot completely eliminate poverty, but there's a lot of things we can do to try to help. And so we can provide emotional support and advice to poor, homeless, or runaway students. There are some students who don't really understand there's a better life than that poverty they've grown up in. Some students completely understand that there is something different and there is a better life. I've mentioned this before. My brother has a friend that he grew up with that was from a very, very, very poor family. Mama didn't work. I think she sold drugs maybe on the side, but anyway, kid was very poor, but he had friends that were all kind of in that middle class. And so he hung out with those kids, and the parents of those kids made sure the kid had something to eat and he was taken care of, and a lot of times he would stay the night with these different families. And they were talking one day about, what would you do if you had $1 million? And they were saying, oh, I'd go buy this car, or I would go buy this or that, or all these extravagant things. And this kid said, I would go to the grocery store and buy everything they have. And I remember thinking, wow. And the reason that he said that was because he didn't know where his meal was coming from every day. He hoped that he was with one of our families so he would have a meal. And that was so foreign to me at the time. I'd never been around somebody who just didn't know where the next meal was coming from. And so when I saw that firsthand, it really made an impact on me. And so as I think about students that are in poverty, I think about, okay, I can provide support, if nothing else, just somebody to talk to, somebody to give advice to. A lot of times these students maybe don't know how to apply to college because they don't have that support at home, or they don't have internet access to where they can use resources that are available. And so maybe that's a chance for me as a teacher to provide support, or to give them some advice, or maybe give them some resources they could use. Another thing that teachers need to make sure they do is report any abuse that students are going through. And so abuse is another social issue we'll talk about. And this could be drug abuse, this could be physical abuse, it could be sexual abuse, it could be a number of types of abuse. But if we suspect that abuse is happening, we have to report it. We've mentioned that in Chapter 8 with the law and ethics. That is something we have to report. And then be aware of cultural mismatches between middle class schools and poor students. And again, those hidden rules of generational poverty. So if you have a school that is primarily middle class students, well, again, they're going to want to achieve a high level, and they're going to be motivated by wanting to be the best and really wanting to push themselves, or somebody else is pushing them to be really successful, where these